It's a beautiful fall day in the mountains of Appalachia, and today is our last reading of Alex Stewart. But first I have to show you this gigantic leaf that just fell right here where I was sitting. Isn't it beautiful? So pretty. Those are my favorite. I think that's a poplar leaf, but I may be wrong. I think that's what it is though. Beautiful leaf. So this is our last part of Alex Stewart. If you've missed any of the previous readings though, please look in the description below for a playlist. Several would-be craftsmen heard of Alex and wanted to apprentice with him. He welcomed them all, and he tried with care and patience to teach them what he knew. Some of them stayed with him for weeks at a time, and of course he charged nothing for his teaching, nor for their rooms and board. I asked him about one of his former students. "Whatever happened to the boy who stayed here for so long and worked with you?" "That boy from Nebraska? I got a letter from him t'other day. What happened to it, Mutt?" Alex started pawing through a stacks of papers and letters which lay on the little table. He ignored the fact that a dozen or so trinkets and papers fell to the floor. Mutt started to tell him where to find the letter, but Alex pretty much ignored him or pretended to. Finally, he found the letter, and he left the table and the surrounding floor littered with papers and other items. "Here it is. Oh, he thanked me something terrible for learning him to make all those things. He sent me a picture here of a rocking chair he made. Looks pretty nice, too, but I think it's bottomed with twine. I bet I showed him 50 times how to make a chair. He finally caught on. Here's a picture of 2 straight chairs. They don't look too bad, neither. He undertook to make a bucket for his mother. Well, he worked and he worked and he worked on that bucket. And I got sorry for him. I said, 'Now, Frank, you've just got to remember one thing.' He said, 'What's that?' I said, 'You've got to make it in your head before you make it with your hands.' He said, 'I'm doing the best I can.' I saw he wasn't getting nowhere, and I sat in and helped him. And oh, he was pleased to death when we got it finished. He said his mother would sure be pleased with that. Now, I believe that he was as nice a learnt boy as ever I've knowed. The first time you heard him talk, you wouldn't think there's anything to him, but he's got a head full of sense." Even before he went to Washington, Alex was beginning to gain recognition outside his home county. Dr. Thomas Burton of East Tennessee State University was instrumental in producing a documentary film, Alex Stewart Cooper. In 1974, I introduced film producer Joe Adair to Alex. The result was that Alex became the star in a documentary film on Kentucky and Tennessee produced by the Westinghouse Corporation and shown to millions of people throughout the country. In 1975, the phenomenally successful Foxfire series included Alex in the Foxfire 3 volume. The 58 pages, 60 photographs, and numerous illustrations devoted to his cooperage presented Alex to millions of readers throughout the nation. In 1975, Alex was featured in full color on the cover of the National Geographic book, The Craftsman of America. And while in Washington in 1976, he was given a personal tour of the National Geographic offices by the Society president, Robert Dole. His popularity continued to grow. He appeared on the covers of the Tennessee Valley Authority's Perspective and the Tennessee Folklore Society publication Bulletin. Magazine and newspaper articles about the Little Mountain Craftsman become common. He was even sought out and interviewed for the Japanese version of Playboy magazine. The city of Oak Ridge, describing him as a superb craftsman and a wise and greatly loved philosopher, designated April 29, 1978 as Alex Stewart Day. Several years later, the Hancock County Commission officially set aside the first Friday in each October as Alex Stewart Day in that his native county. In addition to the Museum of Appalachia, his crafts have been displayed in the Children's Museum at Oak Ridge, the Tennessee State Museum in Nashville, the Smithsonian, the Folk Arts Center in Asheville, North Carolina, and Silver Dollar City near Gatlinburg, Tennessee. This popular theme park celebrated Alex Stewart Day in October of 1984. Tennessee's governor, Lamar Alexander, described him as an amazing craftsman, and U.S. Senator Howard Baker said that Alex had brought dignity and significant historic value to our folk culture. Foxfire editor Elliot Wigington said, "I'd put Alex at the very top of the list, hands down, of old-time craftspeople." He was shown in television commercials, on note cards, and was the subject of a most detailed pencil drawing by artist Bruce Corbin. He was in constant demand to participate in major craft shows and mountain festivals in the region. A slide presentation of Alex and his crafts was shown throughout the duration of the 1982 World's Fair in Knoxville, but the crowning accolade came when he was chosen to receive the National Heritage Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts Division of Folk Crafts. He was one of only 16 people in the country to receive such an award that year, and the first Tennessean ever to receive this honor. Many people wrote letters and made contacts in Alex's behalf, but it was largely through Bill Henry's untiring efforts that Alex was chosen for the award. Although he was now 92 and unable to walk more than a few faltering steps, he was as determined to make the trip to Washington as he had been 6 years earlier, even more so, I think. I think the $5,000 that went with the award had something to do with it. His granddaughter, Sherry, a nurse from Rogersville, Tennessee, accompanied Alex on the trip and provided him with the constant and attentive care. His granddaughter, Sherry, a nurse from Rogersville, Tennessee, accompanied Alex on the trip and provided him with constant and attentive care. Rick and Bill also accompanied him, and I joined them for the award ceremony described in Chapter 1. Finally, in that same year, Alex received the Governor's Outstanding Tennessean Award. The notoriety Alex received affected him not one iota. To my knowledge, he never saw any of the films in which he was involved, nor any of the television programs or commercials. I asked him once about the National Geographic book on whose cover he appeared, and an unsuccessful search was made for it in the environs of his piled-up table. Mutt finally remembered that Alex had given his only copy to someone who admired it. Alex valued his friends, his neighbors, and his relatives most. He cared little about publicity and therefore paid little or no attention to television or movie cameras. It never occurred to him to try and present himself in any kind of special way, to be anything other than himself. He summed it up pretty well when he said, "I never did believe in getting all diked up just because company was coming. A terrapin wears the same hull all its life." The Last Days, Chapter 18. I never thought I'd come to this. The spring of 1982 was a bad one for Alex. His health had deteriorated to the point where he couldn't retain even the few bites of food he ate, and his strength was waning daily. He was beyond any type of work, even whittling, and he spent the long days either lying in bed or sitting in the chair beside it. Loneliness and his inability to engage in any of his crafts contributed to his despondency, and this, I think, retarded his recovery. I visited him on the first day of May of that year and found him in bed, recuperating from pneumonia. He was weak and so short of breath that he couldn't talk above a whisper. He said he hadn't been able to eat anything and was just living off the medicine the doctor prescribed for him. He had just returned from the hospital where he said they had given him 7 quarts of glucose. I told him I'd brought some grits and he agreed to try them. By this time, Rick had arrived, and as we went to the kitchen to fix the grits, we talked about Alex's alarming condition, and we both feared the end was near. When we returned to his room, we found he had crawled out of bed and was sitting in his chair. The grits seemed to agree with him, and he ate almost half a bowl. Now that's the most food I've eaten in a month. Within an hour, the old Alex Stewart had returned. He was weak and frail, but he was back. He was talking about the weight he had lost, and I asked him how much he weighed. "I've got a pair of scales in there, but I weigh such a little that I hate to get on them. I know I don't weigh over 100 pounds if I weigh that." He decided to light his pipe, and he chuckled when he noticed the amount of smoke he had produced. This reminded him of a story. I was down here at the store one day trading, and there was a lady that come in that weighed, I guess, over 200 pounds. Her legs was as big around as a churn, and she was the nearest naked of any woman I ever saw in my life. Just a little narrow piece of cloth up here and shorts on that didn't half cover up her behind. Nobody knowed where she come from. She was a-grabbing things right out from in under me, groceries and things, and she might nigh run over me 2 or 3 times, sort of shoved me out of the way. I was smoking my pipe, and she looked at me and said, "Shoo, what's that smell?" She says, "How in the world do you stand that awful smell? Why do you smoke that stuff?" I says, "Lady, that's the only protection I've got. If I get around somebody I don't like, I just light up my pipe and I'm shed of them." Buddy, she took right out that door, and that like to have tickled the storekeeper to death. Said that was worth $5 just to see. I was afraid that Alex's animated storytelling would weaken him even more, but it seemed to have the opposite effect. The members of his family always said that the company of people he liked was his best medicine. Indeed, it did seem so. After a few minutes, I asked him if he was getting tired. "No, I never get tired of talking. If I was like I used to be, I could wire out a dozen fellers and still want to talk on." "Well, since you're not too tired, I'll ask you one last question. How did Panther Creek get its name?" "This valley used to be filled up with panthers way back yonder." "What exactly is a panther?" "Oh, they was great big animals, bigger than a big dog. They was brownish looking, and their noses had a little whitish circle around it. They had great long claws, and they'd kill your pigs, calves, and they'd jump on you too. The devilish mean things, they'd eat you up. Didn't you ever see one? I've seen them that would weigh, I guess, 150 pounds. The last one I saw was the one the Burchett boys down here killed. Every time the dogs would tree it, it would jump out when he heard them coming. They run it all night and finally got him treed about daylight. They shot it out of the tree, and it whooped 7 dogs, but they finally killed it. It was 7 feet long from the end of his nose to the end of his tail. My great-great-uncle, Grandsard Holland, lived right down the valley here, and he followed hunting all the time. He had the best old hound dog in the whole community. He was awful big. Old Jake was his name, and he was a regular tree dog. One night he treed up here on the ridge, and when Uncle Grandsard went to him, he saw it was a panther. He shot it 1 or 2 or 3 times with his old muzzle-loading rifle. The last shot wounded him, but it didn't kill him. Here it come down out of that tree and right on top of that dog. Well, that was Uncle Grandsard's last bullet. He had a pewter spoon that he carried to eat with, and he grabbed that spoon and bit the end off and chewed it up and made a rifle ball out of it. He put that bullet in his gun and killed that panther, but by that time he had split the dog's entrails out. Poor old Jake, Uncle said, "You're a gone dog." He stuffed his guts back in his belly and carried him home and sewed him up. He went back and carried that panther home, skinned him, and rendered him out. He took the grease he rendered from that panther and greased old Jake with it every once in a while, and that cured him. He got well. I kept a pretty close check on Alex for the next few weeks, and miraculously his health improved markedly. He ate the grits once or twice a day, claiming it was the only food that he could eat, and he wondered why he hadn't thought of them himself. Perhaps the most important factor contributing to Alex's remarkable recuperation that summer were the frequent visits to his home by several young nurses. The program was sponsored by a group called Your Home Visiting Nurse Service, a nonprofit organization funded by Medicare. The nurses kept a watch on his general health and made sure he took the medicines the doctor prescribed, but the best medication of all were the visits themselves. The nurses fell in love with Alex and he with them. Mudd allowed that nobody but the nurses could get him to visit the doctor or go to the hospital when his blood pressure became dangerously high. Every time I visited him, he had some story about Ella Freeman, whom he called Sis, or Clara Holt, or Linda Collins. He began to start whittling again, and I was told that he even made a walking cane or two. There's a nurse here yesterday to see me, and she asked if I had a big Thanksgiving. I said, I bet they ain't a person in the country that had as big a Thanksgiving as I had. She said, what did you have? I told her I had a turkey and 8 big hens. 8 hens? She said. Are you telling me the truth? Yeah, I said. I had the turkey on the table for dinner while the 8 hens was standing out there in the yard. Alex laughed heartily at his joke. One day, Ella, Rick, and his granddaughter Renee brought Alex down to the museum mainly to see his old log cabin, which by now was fully restored. He was delighted. He was the official tour guide, pointing out various features about the fireplace, the pole rafters, and the notching used on the poplar logs. At noon, he had a hearty meal with the entourage at our table. Then he was ready to tour the remainder of the museum village. He was largely confined to his wheelchair, but he thoroughly enjoyed explaining to his girlfriends the uses for many of the pioneer relics as well as the herbs that grew in the gardens. Tourists gathered around to hear firsthand about the crossbow, the handmade bear trap, and numerous other items. At the end of the day, he was still going strong. His enthusiasm never waned and his gaiety never faltered. Alex's friendship with the visiting nurses was not without its problems. One of his old girlfriends, Maddie Jane, apparently got wind of his young visitors, and she made some disparaging remarks about them. This, of course, infuriated Alex. Did she really get mad about the nurses coming here to visit you? Yeah, she sure did. She didn't like it and throwed off on them. That she's the longest-tongued woman ever you saw. I like her and all like that, but she has to keep that tongue a-wagging. She'd talk about the Savior. Was she serious about wanting to marry you? Yeah, she'd have married me in a minute. Shucks, yeah. She called up here so much I could might near tell her ring, and I wouldn't answer the phone, he laughed. I wouldn't marry her if she was strung with pure gold. What do I want with a woman to sit here and look at? No benefit to me. Alex Haley accompanied me to visit Alex once about the time he, Alex Stewart, was having trouble with his erstwhile lady friend. She phoned Alex and launched a verbal attack that got louder and more spirited as she continued. Alex Haley, Mutt, and I could hear her as well, perhaps better than Alex was able to hear her. He tried unsuccessfully to interject a few bits of humor, but she never gave him a chance. Alex laid the receiver in his lap for a while, but Maddie Jane never paused in her barrage. Alex was much amused and finally said, I think I'll just let her go, whereupon he took the receiver and hung it up. By 1984, it became apparent that the Alex Stewart story was a never-ending one and that I would never fully complete it, at least not in time for Alex to see it. So I decided to wrap it up as best I could with one last visit in the fall of that year. It was Thanksgiving weekend, 1984. The night had been cold, but by mid-morning a blanket of warmth had spread over the countryside, the result of the bright sun and the total absence of any wind. Everywhere there was stillness, quiet, sunshine, and cedar trees. Majestic green cedars grew in such profusion and abundance here as to cause them to be seldom appreciated, but their beauty is not diminished by this lack of appreciation. Their deep, rich green seemed even more dramatic against the backdrop of stark, dormant hardwood trees. By the time I reached Sneedville, I'd started to think of Alex and the world he saw and knew as a child. There were many authentic reminders of the past, but there were also evidences of a modern lifestyle encroaching upon the pastoral countryside. The approach to Sneedville from the south followed the Clinch River. No change here from pioneer times, and no change either on the steep ridges and bluffs which lay across from this most beautiful and historic stream. A few miles further and I was in the real world of Alex Stewart. Panther Creek was on my right and Indian Mountain rose sharply beyond. Fenced fields contained small herds of cattle and a surprisingly large number of horses. They grazed on the lush fescue as if it were midsummer. There had been no miracle grass like Kentucky fescue in Alex's time. There were fields of corn, mature and brown, and smaller patches where the tobacco crops had been raised. Some barns were still laden with the golden leaves of curing barley, but more often there were piles of tobacco stalks beside the barns, indicating that it had been handed off. It seemed that half the vehicles on the Panther Creek Road were old model trucks loaded with baskets of tobacco bound for Margate in Tazewell or Rogersville or maybe even Knoxville. Blue smoke rose from the chimney of nearly every house, and ricks of oak and hickory were stacked on the porches and in the yards. I don't remember a single homestead without a turnip patch, and I saw 2 women pulling turnips and picking greens for dinner. There were small hillside houses with big cars from Maryland, Michigan, and Indiana, owned by the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of those who lived there. The families almost always come home on Thanksgiving, Christmas, the 4th of July, and especially Memorial Day. That's when they visited and decorated the graves of their relatives. They called it Decoration Day. Newman's Ridge was in full view now, and it remained the same gentle, tree-covered mountain I imagined it to have been when pioneer Boyd Stewart first came there. But down on Panther Creek, the mix of the old and the new was everywhere. Abandoned privies set beside shiny house trailers, log beehives rested underneath television discs, and an old Melungeon woman helped her granddaughter from a green Pontiac that bore a Baltimore sticker. The countryside was largely devoid of people, no children out swinging in the apple trees, playing bullpen, or exploring the mysteries of Panther Creek. I saw no boys rabbit hunting, running their trap lines, or hunting arrowheads in the meadows. No men were out salting their cattle, butchering hogs, or just fooling with their hounds. I wondered why. The day was so beautiful and the country so picturesque. I wondered why weren't people out enjoying it. The answer came to me suddenly when I realized it was Saturday morning and that there was a television antenna on nearly every home. I could imagine a group of pajama-clad children in front of every set, and how later in the afternoon the men would gather to watch football games. It was the day that Tennessee played Kentucky. I passed the local beer joint, recently built, and thought of how Mutt always complained about its appearance in the neighborhood, saying it was a dirty shame that the good people didn't get together and have it closed. Another minute and I could see Alex's little white house on the hill above the road with Newman's Ridge looming in the background. Then I was there. The sawmill was a hive of activity. Sam and 3 more sons of Alex were there, Frank, Lloyd, and Vol. There were several other helpers. Some rolled the big logs to the ravenous saw. Sam operated the carriage while the younger men carried both the plank and the slabs away. There was no use trying to talk over the noise of this contraption. I'd see them later. It was just as well, for I was anxious to see the patriarch of the hills anyway. Alex was almost blind now, reading only with the aid of a magnifying glass. He could walk just a few agonizing steps, and his severely arthritic hands no longer permitted him to engage in whittling, the last of hundreds of activities he had mastered throughout his life. When I opened the door, I could barely see him for the smoke. He had just lit his pipe and was puffing vigorously, sitting in his chair facing the window as he always did. He laughed when he saw me. "Well, you did make it. I'm sure proud to see you. Get you a chair." I asked about his health, and for a fleeting minute he indulged in a trace of self-pity. "Ah, I ain't much, John Rice. The old gray mare ain't what she used to be. Can't walk or whittle, and can't half see. I'm just here. I never thought I'd come to this." I turned the recorder on for the last time, and soon Alex had gone back to those early days on Newman's Ridge, to the happy, carefree times of his youth and childhood. We had returned to another time, and there was no shiny house trailers, television antennas, or big cars from Baltimore and Detroit. The last time I visited Panther Creek was April 17, 1985, and there were more people around the Stewart home place than I had ever seen. They stood in clusters or moved slowly and quietly from one group to another. The apple trees were blooming, the lilacs spread their fragrance across the meadows, and the grass was lush and dark. But it was nevertheless the most sad and somber day that had ever come to Panther Creek. Alex Stewart was dead. I had received word on Saturday that Alex's condition had worsened and that he'd been taken to the Rogersville Hospital. I arrived a few hours later to find his room and the adjoining hall crowded with kin. They said he had been asking for me, and they escorted me to his bedside. Though he gasped for every breath and his voice was just a muffled whisper, he wanted to talk. He asked about my folks, the weather, and how the crops were doing. His granddaughters, Carol Sue, Wanda, Kathy, Sherry, and Renee, had been caring for him night and day. They wiped the perspiration from his brow, gave him sips of water, and adjusted his pillow every few minutes. When they were not otherwise occupied, they held his hands. He loves for us to hold his hands. That soothes him better than anything. And so it seemed. Talking was a strain for him, and I soon told him that I'd come back to see him in a day or two. I didn't understand his reply, but his granddaughter, Kathy, later told me he'd said, "Come back before 12 tomorrow." He died the following day at 11:35. Writer Elizabeth Gaynor and photographer Carrie Havistow were visiting with us for a few days while working on an article for Parade magazine, and they accompanied my wife Elizabeth and me to the funeral. We parked at the sawmill, and the first one to greet us was Rick, the only one of Alex's many descendants to take up the Cooper trade. He asked us to sit with the family at the funeral. "We always think of you as part of the family," he said. I could think of no higher compliment from a close-knit, clannish mountain family. We went first to McNeil's funeral home in Sneedville, where the body lay. The chapel was full, mostly with relatives, and they sat talking in whispers or weeping softly. At the front of the room was the open coffin, handmade of red cedar. Cedar had always been Alex's favorite wood, and I thought of his remark about the many coffins he had made. I never charged a dime for making a coffin, for I knowed I'd need one myself someday. He was dressed in his overalls with his pipe in his bib pocket, and he wore a white shirt. He always wore a white shirt for very special occasions. In a few minutes, the procession formed behind the hearse, and we made our way to the Panther Creek Missionary Baptist Church, just 2 miles from Alex's home. As the caravan slowly wended its way out of the village and up Panther Creek, every car and every truck that we met was stopped, and the occupants sat in solemn respect. Old men working in their gardens and women tending their flowers stood motionless and silent as we passed. It was Alex's final trip up Panther Creek, everyone knew. The dirt and gravel road to the little church on the hill was steep and rough, and a pickup truck stalled and rolled backward, nearly hitting a black Lincoln Continental that bore a Texas license plate. Someone said the Lincoln belonged to one of his granddaughters. There was no one telling us where to park or where not to park. Everyone found a place in the church lot or in an adjoining field, and when all available space was taken, the road itself was used for parking. The pallbearers carried the coffin to the front of the church and placed it amid a profusion of flowers. Family members, friends, neighbors, and admirers soon filled the little church to capacity, and others stood outside the open doors and along the sides of the building. It was the warmest day of the year, and the cross breeze was most welcome. The Reverend Lester Green opened the ceremony. He read the scriptures and talked about his visits with Alex and the faith he professed. He talked about how Alex was now in a home of no more sin, sorrow, or suffering. Then he was joined by a woman and 2 other men who formed a quartet. One of the men hummed a long drone-like tone to set the pitch, and their clear, resonant voices rose without accompaniment, as natural and as beautiful as the spring countryside that we could all see through the open doorways. One of the old hymns was, "In a Land Where We'll Never Grow Old," and I thought how Alex would have liked that. As the chords of that mournful old hymn wafted over the meadows of Panther Creek, the coffin was opened for the last time. One by one, all those present filed by for the final farewell. We were sitting within a few feet of the coffin, and it was heartrending to observe the sorrow on the faces of those who had loved the old man so much. There was his protege, Bill Henry, his dear friends Kyle and Dora Boland, the nurses who had cared for him so faithfully, and the granddaughters whom I'd last seen the night before Alex died, sitting by his bedside, holding his gnarled hands. There was Rick and Renee, who grew up with him, and who had the kind of relationship children are supposed to have with their grandfathers. Everyone tried to retain his composure, but when they saw Alex for what they knew would be the last time, they wept openly. His 9 children were all there. They each held his hand for a moment, and the girls each kissed his brow and whispered a barely audible goodbye. One of the sons collapsed in front of the coffin and had to be carried out by 3 nearby men. But the saddest sight of all was when Mutt came forward to view his venerated father for the last time. No one would miss Alex more than he. The coffin was closed, the pallbearers carried the pretty cedar casket to the waiting hearse, and those in attendance left the church and found their vehicles. We were on our way to Trent's Cemetery, which is located on a hill at the back of the old Tivis Johnson place. We passed plowed fields waiting for the Burley tobacco plants, and we passed the old log barn which Alex had once suggested that I should buy. We reached the cemetery at the crown of a hill with a commanding view of Panther Creek Valley and Newman's Ridge. A few words from the preachers, a prayer, and the crowd was dismissed. Then Alex was lowered into the grave beside his beloved Margie and the 2 children they lost so long ago. People milled around and talked about what a fine funeral it had been and how good the singing was. One old man looked about him and suddenly realized that he was out of step even with the rural folk of Panther Creek. He remarked to a friend that he was the only man there wearing overalls. "No," his friend replied, "you're not the only one. Alex is wearing his overalls, too." The old man nodded and seemed relieved. A wrinkled old lady said, "I've knowed him all my life," and a younger man said, "I couldn't have had a better neighbor." Someone else observed that all his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren had either attended the funeral or paid their respects at the funeral home. The crowd dispersed slowly, and the people went their separate ways. A few minutes later, we joined relatives and close friends at Alex's house. Both the kitchen table and the dining rooms were laden with food, which had been brought in by neighbors. It reminded me of the many birthday parties we'd attended in honor of Alex, but there was no laughter nor merriment today, no birthday to be celebrated. Every room in the house was filled, as was the front porch and much of the front yard. People talked of their memories of Alex, about what a long and productive life he had lived, and how he was better off now. I walked up the little dirt road behind the house toward the barn. I didn't feel like talking. The anvil in the blacksmith shop was beginning to rust, and the forge clearly had not been fired in years. I passed the log crib where Alex stored his corn, and the barn shed where he had worked so long and faithfully. No one was in sight, and I felt completely alone with the memories of my old friend. His old Cooper tools still hung on the wall, and the ancient Stewart tool chest where Alex kept his smaller and more valuable hand tools sat nearby. But the shavings were no longer rich in color and clean with fragrance. They were dusty and without luster or aroma. As I started back toward the house, I saw Sam coming up the road from the sawmill. He and Alex were as close as a father and son could be. We met at the blacksmith shop. I never knew whether he was going to the barn to be alone or whether he came because he knew I was there. I never asked. When we met, he said, "Pap wanted you to have his old tool chest." I said, "No, that ought to stay in the family. Rick is the only one left to carry on the Stewart trade, and it ought to go to him." "No," Sam said in a warm but resolute manner. "Pap told me just a few days ago that he wanted you to have it. Rick does too. You've done so much for Pap. You can put it in the museum along with the stuff you've got that he made. If you don't come and get it, we'll bring it to you." The hardest part of the day was leaving. Poor Mutt came to see me off, but he couldn't say anything. I think he knew we'd no longer see much of one another. He put his arm around me, and finally he said in a halting, barely audible voice, "We love you." That's all he could get out. I said, "I love you too, Mutt." That was the first time, I think, that I've ever said that to a man. We had lost our greatest friend, and that mutual loss had somehow brought us closer together. I may never return to Panther Creek, I thought as we drove away. Without Alex Stewart, it would never be the same, and I wanted to remember it as it was. We had to pass the little graveyard as we drove out of the valley, and we were all silent as we did so. The cemetery was several hundred yards off the main road, but we could see the grave tent and the multicolored flowers surrounding it. I remembered what Alex had said about death. Everybody that's born has their days numbered, and when it comes your time to go, all the herbs, medicine, doctors, hospitals, and everything else can't change it. You can shorten your days by what you do, but you can't prolong them. So that concludes our reading of Alex Stewart, Portrait of a Pioneer. Wonderful book. Kind of a really sad, bittersweet ending, but I like that John Rice really shared his feelings, and you can tell he was heartbroken when Alex died, even though, of course, they, as Alex said, everyone that's born, as he would say it, is appointed once to die. You know, we're all going to die. We can't escape death. Even that, sharing that part was part of Alex's wisdom, but and lots through the book that I enjoyed, the wisdom that he would share. One of the ones in this part I wrote down was the part about when John Rice was saying he didn't care about what he looked like. He didn't try to put on airs, but he said, "I never did believe in getting all dyked up just because company was coming. A terrapin wears the same hole all his life." I like that. Of course, I like to dress up. I like to, you know, fix my hair and put on nice clothes. But I understand what Alex is saying. We all have to be who we are. You can't pretend to be somebody else. And I don't think I do that at all, even though, of course, I do like to comb my hair and put my clothes on, as Granny would say. But I enjoyed that part. I thought it was interesting, the part about that John Rice brought him some grits, and that seemed to give him a second life there for a little bit. When I'm sick, that's one of the things I want to eat is grits. If I'm sick and I can't think of anything else to eat, I want a bowl of grits with butter and sugar in it. And it's something that always seems easy on my stomach, but also gives me sustenance. So I really liked that part, because I feel the same way about grits. Of course, I'm not going through what Alex was going through, but anytime I'm sick and can't really find something that I want to eat, can't think of something, grits will work for me. Grits or cinnamon toast and chocolate milk. Now, the part of the story he was talking about the panthers, I like that. Lots of times we call them painters here in Appalachia, but I don't know, the part about chewing up the silver spoon, the pewter spoon, might sound a little bit like a tall, windy tale to me. I'm not sure about that part, but it did make for a good story, so I'm glad that Alex shared it, but that seems a little bit unbelievable. And when John Rice was talking about the funeral, of course, so sad, but also sounds like it was a beautiful funeral. The song "Where We'll Never Grow Old," that's a song that I grew up singing in church. Corey and Katie grew up singing it. I have a video of Pap and Paul. I will link to it so that you can hear them sing it. But when Corey and Katie were really little and we would be in church singing, and they would sing in the choir, one time I realized what they both thought that the song, I don't think we weren't singing, but they had learned the song there at church, and then maybe we were in a car and they were just singing it to themselves, and they thought that it said "Where we will never grow cold." So they were singing "Where we'll never grow cold," which was funny, but then also it's a place, like John Rice said, with no suffering, and he was quoting the preacher, no sin, no sorrow, no suffering. So being cold would sure be suffering. So I guess that makes sense too. Although the part about not growing old is awful touching the older I get, and especially thinking of the loved ones who are elderly, like Alex was at that point, but like Granny and like my father before he died, like Pap. So this has just been a wonderful book. I hope that you've enjoyed it as much as I have. I hope you'll leave a comment about this last little bit that we read. And I hope you'll drop back by next Friday, because we'll have a new book to start. I'm still not sure what it is. I usually wait. I've got 2 or 3 picked out, and it's all the way to the last day before I decide which one. But do tune back in next Friday for the new book.